Okay, good morning, everybody. And today, I'm going to lecture on drugs for hypertension. This is actually the first group of agents you will encounter under drugs acting on the cardiovascular system. No? So, probably we will start first with some recall of basic concepts learned in physiology. Okay. So I think these equations are quite familiar to you, no? So we know that blood pressure is a product of cardiac output times the peripheral vascular resistance or total peripheral resistance. And cardiac output in turn is a product of stroke volume and the heart rate, no? So these determinants of blood pressure are actually influenced by several mechanisms of homeostasis. For example, your heart rate is increased by the sympathetics and decreased by the parasympathetics, no? Um, through the vagus nerve. The stroke volume is increased with increased cardiac contractility, an increase in cardiac preload and filling pressure brought about by increase in venous return. So you recall your Frank-Starling's law, no? And it is also subsequently affected and decreased by cardiac afterload. No? Your preload is determined by venous return, as I mentioned, and intravascular volume. Intravascular volume, in turn, is affected by influences of the sympathetic nervous system, aldosterone, your antidiuretic hormone, and natriuretic peptides. No? The peripheral vascular resistance is actually the um, afterload, no? The cardiac afterload, and this is affected by direct innervation of adrenergic receptors as well as circulating and local regulators. This is inversely related, if you recall, with stroke volume. So if you have an increase in afterload or total peripheral resistance, then your stroke volume tends to go down. So these are the areas of control of blood pressure, cardiac function. Then you have your vascular tone, the arteriolar or what we call as the resistance vessels, and the tone in the venous or capacitance vessels. And there's a third area, which is renal function. No? Okay. Now, you also remember that there are baroreceptors, no? Baroreceptors in the aortic arch and carotid sinuses, which respond to stretch, and they will send inhibitory signals to the brainstem through the vagus nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve. No? Similarly, there are also baroreceptors in the ventricles and atria, which responds to feeling pressure. So when BP rises, the inhibition diminishes, and there is therefore inhibition of sympathetic efferent outflow. So your peripheral vascular resistance and heart rate goes down. If BP goes down, then there will be less of this tonic inhibition, so you have greater sympathetic efferent outflow, and therefore heart rate and vascular resistance increase, and BP will rise. No? In the brainstem, vasoconstriction and increased heart rate are mediated by the sympathetic nervous system. And so signals from the efferent nerves, cranial 9 and 10, will communicate with the vagal nucleus to decrease heart rate through the vagus nerve. No? And then we talk about renal function. No? There's also central control of renal function to modulate renal blood flow, the GFR, sodium and water excretion, and the release synthesis and release of renin. No? So these mechanisms will regulate intravascular flow, peripheral vascular resistance, and in turn, the blood pressure. No? So the kidneys also give out inhibitory reflexes. So when you have a rise in urine flow, this will eventually activate sensory nerves in the renal pelvic wall. No? And this activation of sensory nerves will decrease sympathetic activity in the kidneys, and that will induce natriuresis and diuresis. No? So the renal sensory nerve responses are modulated um, by dietary sodium, such that high sodium intake will often enhance responsiveness, no, of these uh, sensory responses. Okay. So you recall the renin-angiotensin. So these are the these are the sites of action of your different antihypertensives, as I mentioned. No? So, and these are the various chief mechanisms by which they produce a lowering of your cardiac output. No? So you recall the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and you know that the system also is a regulatory mechanism for blood pressure. No? So they regulate blood volume and systemic vascular resistance in similar to the function of your baroreceptors. But the difference is that the RAS will respond more, become operative in chronic BP changes. No? For acute changes, it's the baroreceptors that give the initial response. No? Okay. When blood flow to the kidneys are diminished, no, the juxtaglomerular cells will convert pre-renin into renin, no, and this is secreted in the circulation. So renin will convert angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, which is acted upon by your angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, to convert it into angiotensin 2, which we know is a potent vasoconstrictor. No? At the same time, your angiotensin 2 is also a stimulator of the release of aldosterone from adrenal cortex. And aldosterone causes reabsorption of sodium and water in the tubules, and this will in turn cause excretion of potassium, no? Because potassium is the currency for sodium reabsorption. So every time you reabsorb sodium, you throw out in exchange potassium. So potassium is lost in the urine. And this mechanism will facilitate an increase in extracellular fluid, and this subsequently translates into elevated blood pressure. So it is said that the control of blood pressure will be similar for normotensives and hypertensive individuals. It's just that the baroreceptors and renal perfusion responses to blood pressure changes are become operative at a higher level when we talk about hypertension, for hypertensives, I mean. So generally, the drugs for hypertension will interfere with this reflex response, no? And they are grouped or classed uh, based on their mechanism of action and or their site of action, no? And they basically act either by reducing cardiac output and or systemic vascular resistance, no? So these are the various antihypertensives. These are the main sites where they act and the mechanism, and what is primarily affected to eventually translate to BP lowering effect. Okay. So they are classed as follows. You have the diuretics, the sympatholytics, no, and their corresponding mechanisms of action. You have your direct vasodilators, and I'm sorry for the typo. This should be four, no? The RAS modulators, no? Which act by blocking the action or synthesis of aldosterone to lower peripheral resistance and eventually blood volume. Okay, so let's go to the diuretics first. No, the diuretics, there are actually several diuretics, but the three that you see in the slide are the main diuretics that are used for the control of hypertension. No? So generally, your diuretics act by lowering blood volume and cardiac output. No? And this initial effect to lower blood pressure is often accompanied by a possible initial rise in peripheral vascular resistance. No? Um, but this mechanism by itself does not explain fully the BP lowering effects. No? So there might be other uh, mechanisms that are operative in this case to contribute, no, to uh, BP lowering effect. No? So it is said that after 6 to 8 weeks of continuous use, no, the cardiac output will normalize and the peripheral vascular resistance will lower. No? Diuretics are, the effects of diuretics are greatly enhanced by adopting a low sodium diet, no? Because this will reverse the sodium effects of increased intracellular calcium, leading to um, relaxation of blood vessel walls. No? So these agents can lower blood pressure by as much as 15 millimeters mercury with chronic use. And as maintenance, they are one of the first liners for treating mild to moderate hypertension. No? For more severe cases, we usually combine them with other antihypertensives, specifically because they will tend to reverse the sodium retention effects of other antihypertensives like your sympatholytics and direct vasodilators. No? Okay. So among the among the diuretics, the thiazides are the most commonly used, especially in chronic hypertension. No? So these agents have good oral bioavailability and they have long duration of action. So among African Americans, these are the population that uh, have exhibited excellent response to the BP lowering effects of thiazides, no? Or also hypertensives who have underlying renal disease, primary renal disease as the cause of their hypertension. So as I mentioned, there's an initial decrease in blood volume, and this will result to a decrease in cardiac output, no? And there is an initial rise of the peripheral vascular resistance, and this initial rise is because of the compensatory response of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which causes volume retention that counters the effect of the thiazide. No? But as I mentioned, there are other mechanisms that may be operative in the BP lowering effect of the thiazides. And one of these is that it is believed that thiazides will have, um, with continuous use, also uh, vasodilating effects, no? That will negate the compensatory response of the RAS and this will lead to sustained BP lowering effects. No? Um, so the thiazides will lower blood pressure through a direct effect on cardiac output by reducing intravascular volume, and then eventually also a subsequent reduction in systemic vascular resistance. No? The, in my documents in your workbook, there's a table there of the different prototypes of thiazides, and of this, what stands out is chlorthalidone, no? Because it is said to be the most efficacious of the thiazides, mainly due to um, it having a very long duration of action. Okay. Uh, the loop diuretics, in terms of diuretic effect, no, uh, this has the most diuretic effect of all the different types of diuretics, no. However, they are not as commonly used for the treatment of mild to moderate hypertension, no. The loop diuretics will have relatively short half-lives compared to the thiazides, no? Usually on the average of about 4 to 6 hours. No? They have a very fast diuretic effect, no? But the overall BP lowering effect is modest, no? Especially when you compare it with the thiazides, and this is because of the activation of compensatory responses from neurohormonal regulators of intravascular volume and resistance. No? However, there are certain clinical situations that we can use loop diuretics, that we choose loop diuretics over thiazides. No? So, for example, you have malignant hypertension. These are individuals which manifest with the BP elevation of about 180 over 120 and up, no? And the instances also when you have excessive volume or your volume-based hypertension, such as you see in individuals with the advanced renal disease or renal failure. The loop diuretics are used also in severe cases when there is retention of excessive sodium, no? And this is seen, for example, with the use of multiple sodium retaining drugs, no? In patients who have cardiac failure and liver cirrhosis. And also they're very useful in severe cases of hypertension wherein there is underlying renal function compromise, no? Such as that where the GFR falls below 30 to 40 milliliters per minute. No? Um, so, of the prototypes, I think the most commonly known will be furosemide. No? Then you have ethacrynic acid, no? And others which I have included in the workbook. So the least efficacious of these three will be your potassium sparing diuretics, no? So the potassium sparing diuretics are mainly used along with either thiazide or a loop diuretic to offset the hypokalemic effects that are produced from the use of these two other diuretics, no? So when you combine your potassium sparers with your loop or your thiazide, you will reduce the dose of these two latter diuretics, and therefore decrease the risk for adverse effects, no, such as hypokalemia. And then you have to stop any potassium supplementation already, because the use of potassium sparing diuretics in addition to potassium supplementation may cause the reverse effect, no? Baka ka naman mag-cause ng hyperkalemia. Okay? So potassium-sparing diuretics will also enhance the natriuresis from other types of diuretics. No? Now, one of the prototypes is spironolactone. Spironolactone is an aldosterone receptor blocker, and this is very useful in the treatment of hypertension resulting from hyperaldosteronism. Okay, so your the natriuretic, before we go to the toxicities, now I just want to point out a differentiating point between thiazides and loop diuretics as far as natriuresis is concerned. No? Natriuretic effects of thiazides will increase as you increase the dose. No? So as you approach um, the ceiling, which is 100 to 200 milligrams daily, no, you increase the natriuretic effect. However, the BP lowering effect will remain similar regardless of the whether you're in the low range or the high range of therapeutic dose. No? In contrast, the loop diuretics will have significantly increasing antihypertensive effects when you increase their dose. No? So that's one of the differences in their effects or behavior. Now, on the slide will be the various toxicities. No? So, the most important probably when we talk about the thiazides and your loop diuretics will be hypokalemia. No? For hyperkalemia, this is brought about by potassium sparing. No? Uh, Diuretics. No? Then, together with loss of potassium, you may also lose magnesium in the urine. And this may also create some impairment of glucose tolerance. No? So you have to watch out for this effect, especially if you are dealing with diabetic hypertensives. No? And long-term use have also been associated with increase in serum lipid levels. No? They can increase uric acid and precipitate gout. No? And then we have some of the unique effects coming from your potassium spares. I mentioned hyperkalemia. No? And then spironolactone uh, has an anti-androgen effect. No? So prolonged use of spironolactone may induce gynecomastia in male users, no? Because of its anti-androgenic effects. No? Okay. Now, potassium depletion, no, let me go back to hypokalemia. Potassium depletion is particularly dangerous when your patient has certain underlying cardiac morbidities, like for example, arrhythmia, or has had an acute MI or ventricular dysfunction, no? Um, and those who are also maintaining on digoxin or your digitalis, no? Because hypokalemia can precipitate or aggravate arrhythmias in these conditions. No? And then potassium loss is always linked to sodium retention because as I mentioned, especially when we go to the topic of diuretics, potassium is the currency. No? In the collecting duct, it's the currency for sodium reabsorption. So the more sodium you reabsorb, the more potassium you lose. No? And uh, potassium loss should be minimized, therefore. So when you engage in a uh, sodium restricted diet, you not only prevent too much reabsorption of sodium and enhance the effects of your diuretics, but you also reduce potassium loss. Huh? Okay. Then the second group of agents will be your sympatholytics. So you have your beta blockers, you have your alpha blockers, and then You have those that act centrally. No? So we'll go into them one by one. So there are common medications for hypertension. No? And the initial BP lowering effect is brought about by, for beta blockers, no? Um, for brought about by their interaction with the specific receptors. No? But generally, your sympatholytics will generate, as they lower BP, they generate compensatory mechanisms. No, I have mentioned this in passing in the previous section. No, so sympatholytics, especially with long-term use, are associated with sodium retention and blood volume expansion. That is why they are often combined with diuretics to diuretics will offset this. They will offset this effect of sympatholytics. No, okay. So the beta blockers, the initial effects to lower BP would be the negative chronotropic and inotropic effect. No? So this results to a reduction in heart rate, a reduction in stroke volume and cardiac output. No? But with long-term therapy, it has been shown that they also eventually cause a decline in peripheral vascular resistance. No? And this paradoxic effect is because that with prolonged use, they begin to block also the beta 1 receptors in the kidneys. No? And when they block the beta 1 receptors in the kidneys, this will decrease renin secretion. And so this will diminish production of angiotensin 2, which is one of your potent vasoconstriction constrictors that I have mentioned. No? Now, they would lower BP in hypertensives, but they do not affect normotensives. No? So you do not, if a normotensive will take this, usually do not observe a BP lowering effect. No? Now, beta blockers are used for mild to moderate disease, but as indicated in the slide, it's no longer considered a first-line agent. The first-line agents usually would be your ACE inhibitors or your ARBs, your diuretics, especially your thiazides, and your calcium channel blockers. And the BP lowering effect of beta blockers are said to be less than these four agents. So they are not commonly first line, but they are still very useful. No? They are useful in the treatment of hypertension in certain cases, like patients with other conditions like underlying coronary artery disease or heart failure. They're also very useful for younger persons with hypertension. Then in severe cases, the beta blockers may be included as part of combination therapy, no? Because they can counter reflex tachycardia induced, for example, by the use of direct vasodilators. No? And generally, the use of beta blockers have been associated with reduced mortality in hypertensive patients who have suffered myocardial infarction or heart failure. No, okay. Um, your beta blockers can cause receptor upregulation with prolonged use. No, so why is this important? Because of this, they should not be abruptly discontinued. No, because there's some form of uh, dependence reaction of the receptors. So the receptors, the beta receptors undergo certain reactions or certain changes with or certain adaptations because of chronic exposure to the medication. So because of this, it's very important to remember that if they're used chronically, then patients should not abruptly discontinue them. because of this adaptive responses of the receptors because of chronic exposure to beta blockers. The sudden discontinuation of these agents may precipitate withdrawal symptoms, no? And so patients may manifest with tachycardia, nervousness, tremors, no? If they have angina, it can aggravate or precipitate an attack, and it can also lead into a sudden increase in blood pressure. So that's very, very important, no? Um, Patient education for uh, those who are chronically using beta blockers. Okay. Now, propranolol, we know from the lecture in autonomics, is your prototype of a non-selective. No, it's not cardioselective, so it's both a blocker on beta 1 and beta 2 receptors, no? And because of that, their use in hypertension has been largely replaced by the newer cardioselective beta blockers, no? However, they are still effective in the treatment of hypertension and ischemic heart disease, no? The main mechanism of propranolol is, of course, decreasing cardiac output by beta 1 receptor blockade in the heart, no? And it also inhibits catecholamine stimulation of renin by beta 1 blockade in the kidneys and depression of the renin-angiotensin aldosterone activity, as I mentioned earlier, no? So the antihypertensive effect from this agent um, is not associated with postural hypotension, no? So you don't worry about sudden drop in BP with assumption of a supine position, no? Now, largely its toxicities are extensions of its pharmacologic action. So you can have bradycardia, no? Also because it is a non-selective beta blocker, this can cause aggravation of asthma or COPD, peripheral vascular insufficiency. And for diabetics, one precaution is that they can precipitate and mask hypoglycemic symptoms among diabetics, no? Especially among insulin-dependent diabetics. Okay. Now, of the newer cardioselectives, probably the most common that you have heard about will be metoprolol and atenolol. No? So these are the more common uh, beta blockers. They are cardioselective. No? They have therefore less activity on the beta 2 receptors in the airway. So they are um, safer for those with hyperreactive airways and asthma. They're also safer for diabetics, no? And for those with peripheral vascular insufficiency. Now, the one downside about their beta blockers is that they have short half-lives, no? So we have new sustained release preparations now of metoprolol that is available. Siguro ang metoprolol mga 4 hours lang, and then your atenolol is about 6 hours, no? Um, the use of uh, metoprolol has been found to improve survival among hypertensives with heart failure. So metoprolol is generally found to be more effective than atenolol. Okay? Then you have some other non-selectives. No? Non-selectives will be nadolol and cateolol. And then you have the beta-selective, which is betaxolol and bisoprolol. So all of these will have long half-lives, so they are effective as once a day dosing. The non-selective agents are not significantly metabolized, so they are excreted unchanged in the kidneys. So you will have to probably choose another agent, or you will probably have to reduce their dose in those with renal compromise. No, the beta 1 selectives, betaxolol and bisoprolol, uh, are mainly undergo hepatic biotransformation. Okay. Then you probably heard about labetalol. So what are the special features of labetalol? Well, labetalol is both a beta blocker and it is also a vasodilator. And the usual formulation of labetalol is that it has four isomers in its racemic formulation. No? Of these, two are active. No, you have two active isomers. So I think I made some typo errors in the manuscript. So please just correct that. Of the four isomers, um, two are active. No, the SR isomer has the vasodilator effect by way of alpha adrenoceptor blockade. No? While the potent beta adrenoceptor inhibition will come from the RR isomer. Now, the beta blocking effect is greater than the alpha blocking effect of labetalol after oral dosing. So, the decrease in peripheral vascular resistance with the use of labetalol is not accompanied by an increase in heart rate or cardiac output, no? Because these compensatory responses are opposed by their additional beta blocking effect of the drug. No? So labetalol is useful for hypertensive emergencies and in fake chromocytoma, uh, like the case that you made the concept map for in autonomics. No? Now, there are other beta blockers which are also racemic mixtures. And this is exemplified by carvedilol. No? Carvedilol also has an alpha and a beta blocking action. No? It has an S isomer. The S isomer is a non-selective beta blocker. No? But in contrast to labetalol, its alpha and beta blocking effects coming from the R isomer naman are equal. No? They have equal potency. In labetalol, di ba, it's the beta blocking effect that is greater. But here, they're about equal in terms of potency. No? Carvedilol is metabolized by the liver, so it has a half-life which is about 7 to 10 hours. And carvedilol has been found to reduce mortality in hypertensive patients with heart failure. No? Nebivolol is another racemic mixture. It is a selective beta 1 inhibitor. No? But and also a vasodilator, but its vasodilating effect is not through alpha blockade, no, unlike your labetalol. No, the beta inhibition is contributed uh, it's contributed by its D isomer. No, the L isomer of nebivolol is the one that has the vasodilating effect, and this is through increasing nitric oxide production from the endothelium. No? And this will, as we know, nitric acid is a potent vasodilator. No? So this is in contrast to the acute increases in peripheral vascular resistance by older pure beta blockers. No? So nebivolol is biotransformed in the liver and will have some active metabolites. No? Now, of all the beta blockers, nebivolol is said to have the fewest side effects. Okay, even among other hypertensives. Now, a very short-acting beta blocker is esmolol. No, its half-life is only about 10 minutes. So when it is used, it's when it is administered, it's usually administered as an IV infusion preparation, no? And its short half-life is because it is rapidly hydrolyzed by blood esterases. So its utility is for controlling sudden rises in blood pressure during surgery and post-surgery, and also in hypertensive emergencies, no? In which you have significant tachycardia or there's heart failure. So the short act in such cases, it's particularly safe uh, because the effect is only short acting, and it's easy to discontinue the effects just by stopping the infusion. So this makes for safety. Okay. So then we go to the alpha blockers. No? The alpha blockers, you have the selective alpha blockers. So nandyan yung prazosin, terazosin, doxazosin. And then you have the non-selectives like pentolamine and phenoxybenzamine, which are not very commonly used currently. No? So their main utility currently is for the treatment and diagnosis of hypertension from phaeochromocytoma. Their use is limited to these situations because of the significant reflex tachycardia that occurs in these agents, because they are both inhibitors of alpha 1 and the regulator alpha receptor, which is the presynaptic alpha 2 receptor. No? Okay, so let's concentrate on the selective alpha 1 antagonist. No? They block alpha 1 receptors in both the arterioles and the venules, and this is their mechanism of lowering blood pressure. No? So because they do not affect the function or inhibit the function of your regulatory presynaptic alpha 2, there is less reflex tachycardia uh, compared to what is seen in the selective agents. No? So vasodilation, as I mentioned, occurs in both resistance and capacitance vessels. No? So the VP lowering effects will be more pronounced in the upright position. So one of the most useful situations for the use of alpha 1 blockers is for uh, elderly males with benign prostatic hypertrophy, right? Because it facilitates urinary outflow um, because of this muscle relaxant effect, no? However, there's what we call the first dose response among these users because of this vasodilating effect that is more pronounced in the upright position. So patients can suffer from orthostatic hypotension if they assume a supine position very fast, no? From a reclined or a supine position. So bumabagsak yung BP, and this is something that we have to warn our elderly users, no? Because elderly people have less tolerance of such fluctuations. No? Um, this is mostly observed in the first dose. That's why we have what you call the first dose phenomenon. No? But this effect will tend to dissipate with long-term use. Now, the alpha blockers are best used with diuretics because your alpha blockers can cause salt and water retention, which may decrease eventually their BP lowering effects. No? So they are most effective when used with diuretics in combination therapy. No? For the treatment of usually of benign prostatic hypertrophy, they are given usually at as a nighttime dose. Okay. So of the prototypes, the best bioavailability is observed with terasocin. It has the least first pass effect. No? It undergoes extensive hepatic biotransformation. The bioavailability of the two other agents, doxazocin and prazosin, are a little less than terasocin. So they are said to have intermediate bioavailability. So as I mentioned, they are usually given a single dose at night. No? Um, the other toxicities aside from this first dose hypotension are relatively mild and tolerable, and they are not that common. No? So patients will probably complain of mild dizziness, palpitations, headache, and fatigue. Okay. So let's go to your central acting sympatholytics. No? So generally, except for clonidine, they are not as commonly used today, no? Because we have newer agents that have better safety profile. Okay, so your central acting sympatholytics will act by diminishing sympathetic outflow. So they diminish the discharge of norepinephrine from the brainstem, and this will cause a lowering of heart rate, heart contractility, and vasomotor tone. No? Um, your prototypes of clonidine and methyl dopa will act both on the regulatory presynaptic alpha 2 and also to some postsynaptic alpha 2 receptors uh, to inhibit their activity. No? The clonidine, which causes more lowering in heart rate and cardiac output by methyl dopa, um, is believed to be more effective in this respect because it also binds its additional antihypertensive effect is to its binding to the imidazoline receptor, no? Which also mediates pressure responses. Okay, so the decrease in blood pressure, as I mentioned, of clonidine is brought about by uh, its lowering effect on cardiac output, no, and heart rate, and the relaxation of capacitance vessels or your veins and eventual peripheral vascular resistance. So the vasodilating effect includes the renal vasculature. However, the glomerular filtration rate is maintained. This agent will not cause postural hypotension compared to your other, especially your selective alpha blockers. Clonidine is lipid soluble, so it can rapidly enter the CNS. It has a short half-life, so you might have to give it on split dose in a day, no? Usually twice a day. So there's a new clonidine patch formulation. That's another option. The patch will give you a long-lasting effect of about a week, no, for single-use patch. Okay. Uh, the main problem with the oral clonidine is that because of its, it's lipid soluble, one of its prominent effect is sedation. So the patch formulation, one of the advantage there is it is less sedating. No, but the problem is some will have skin reactions or allergies to the patch. Okay. Another thing to remember about um, clonidine is that depression can be precipitated or aggravated no? So it is usually avoided when the hypertensive patient has also concomitant depression. Okay. Prolonged use of clonidine uh, again induces some receptor adaptation, no? So some dependence mechanism. So it's very important to uh, caution against the abrupt withdrawal, no? For patients who are using clonidine uh, as maintenance for prolonged periods, no, they should never discontinue the drug abruptly, because you can have dangerous withdrawal symptoms. You can have a severe hypertensive crisis. You can have nervousness, uh, severe headache, tachycardia, and even convulsions or seizures. You can have diaphoresis, no? This has been observed even after one or two doses are missed, no? So it's never discontinued abruptly. It is tapered in gradually, no? So if ever the patient will manifest with hypertensive crisis, this is treated by immediate resumption of clonidine or the administration of an alpha and beta blocker. Okay. So uh, methyl dopa is commonly prescribed by obstetricians because its main use is in the treatment of pregnancy induced or pregnancy related hypertension, no? So it reduces peripheral vascular resistance, uh, and just like clonidine, it includes the renal vasculature here, no? However, in contrast to clonidine, the decline in cardiac output and heart rate are less consistent, no? The half-life is about 4 to 6, but because it has an active intermediate, the effect can last for up to 24 hours, no? So the active intermediate is called alpha methyl norepinephrine. Okay, they tend to be stored in the vesicles of the nerve endings. Now, with methyl dopa, the most common toxicity is sedation, especially at the start of therapy, no? And some patients would complain about impaired concentration and mental fatigue with prolonged use, no? What's interesting about methyl dopa is that some users, uh, whether male or female, would report spontaneous milk production. Uh, and this is due to the elevation of prolactin, because methyl dopa is a inhibitor of dopamine. And dopamine is a hypothalamic hormone that regulates the level of prolactin. So if you have an inhibition of dopamine action, then there's nothing to regulate prolactin, and prolactin rises. And one of the clinical manifestations is spontaneous milk production, no? And probably this is also the reason why in uncommon situations, you may also see extrapyramidal signs. And this is also because of the inhibition of dopamine activity by the drug in the nigrostriatal tracts. These are the tracts that modulate graceful movement. So you will see some extrapyramidal movements among long-term users. Um, Other uncommon side effects will be nightmares, as I said, depression, and vertigo, no? With prolonged use also, you can have a positive Coombs test. So there can be blood agglutination, no? You can develop hepatitis and drug fever, but these are reversible when the drug is discontinued. Okay, so let me stop first with the first